My true story from Texas. My son said. You'll be fine in the garage for a while. I slept there for 2 nights. On the third, I handed him the eviction notice. The morning sun felt different through that small garage window. Colder somehow, even though it was July in Houston. My daughter-in-law Sarah stood in the doorway. Her arms crossed like she was guarding something precious. Listen, Margaret, she said, using my full name like I was a stranger. The house is too crowded with you here. The garage has everything you need. Think of it as your own little apartment. I looked around at the concrete floor, the oil stains, the boxes of Christmas decorations from years past. This was supposed to be my home. I had raised 3 children in a house smaller than their living room. I had worked double shifts at the diner for 30 years to buy them school clothes and birthday presents. And now, at 73, I was being told to be grateful for a garage. Sarah's voice got sharper. Besides, you're retired now. You don't need much space. She turned and walked back into the house, leaving me standing there with my one small suitcase and my late husband's old army blanket. That first night, I lay on the camping cot they'd set up for me. The garage door opener above my head made strange noises every few hours. I could hear them through the thin wall that separated me from the kitchen. Their laughter echoed while I shivered under that thin blanket. They were watching a movie, eating popcorn, living their comfortable lives while I counted ceiling tiles in the dark. I thought about my husband Robert. How he'd hold me when I was scared after the thunderstorms. How he'd always say, "Margaret, you're stronger than you know." I whispered those words to myself that night, but they felt hollow in the empty garage. The next morning, my son Tommy poked his head through the door. His hair was messy, his eyes tired. "Morning, Mom. You doing okay out here?" He looked around like he was seeing the garage for the first time. Really seeing it. "I'm fine, sweetheart," I lied. My back ached from the thin mattress. My joints were stiff from the cold concrete floor. But I didn't want to be a burden. That word they kept using. Burden. "We'll get you a little heater soon," he mumbled, not meeting my eyes. "Just need to figure some things out first." I nodded and smiled. I had spent my whole life making things easier for everyone else. Even now, sleeping in a garage, I was still trying to be the perfect mother who never complained. After he left, I sat on the edge of the cot and cried. Not loud, dramatic tears. Just quiet ones that rolled down my cheeks and dropped onto the concrete floor. Felt invisible, like I was disappearing bit by bit. That afternoon I heard them talking in the kitchen. The walls were thin, and sound carried through the gaps around the door. Sarah's voice was clear and sharp. "She can't stay in the house forever, Tommy. We have our own lives to live." "I know, but she's my mom," Tommy said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Your mom who's been interfering with how we raise the kids. Your mom who criticizes everything I cook. Your mom who takes up space we don't have." I pressed my ear closer to the wall. My heart was pounding. "Maybe if she stays out there long enough, she'll realize she needs to find her own place," Sarah continued. "A nice senior living facility or something. They have activities, other people her age. It would be better for everyone." Senior living facility. They were planning to put me away. Like I was a piece of furniture they didn't want anymore. Tommy's voice was quieter now. "The garage is just temporary, right? Until we figure things out." "Of course," Sarah said, but something in her tone made my stomach turn. "Temporary." I stepped back from the wall, my hands shaking. They weren't trying to help me. They were trying to make me so uncomfortable that I'd leave on my own. So they could tell everyone. We tried to help her, but she chose to go to the nursing home. That night I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling and thought about my life. I had been a waitress for 30 years at Mel's Diner on Main Street. I knew every regular customer by name. I remembered their usual orders, their family problems, their birthdays. I had been important to people once. I thought about the small house Robert and I had bought when Tommy was just a baby. How we'd painted every room ourselves, planted the garden, built the swing set in the backyard. I thought about the cookies I'd baked for every school fundraiser, The Halloween costumes I'd sewn by hand, the Christmas mornings when I'd wake up at 5 to start the turkey. Now I was 73, and my own son saw me as a problem to solve. The second night was worse. The temperature dropped, and that thin blanket wasn't enough. I wore my coat to bed, pulled my knitted hat down over my ears. I could hear them watching TV in the living room. The sound of their laughter felt like knives in my chest. Around midnight I heard footsteps on the porch. Then Sarah's voice talking on the phone. "She's still out there," she said. I thought she'd get the hint by now. I held my breath, straining to hear more. "The lawyer said we need to be careful about how we handle this. Can't just throw her out. But if she decides to leave on her own." There was a pause. "Exactly. Then it's her choice." My blood ran cold. They had talked to a lawyer. This wasn't just about space or convenience. This was planned. I sat up on the cot, my mind racing. I had been a waitress for 30 years. I knew how to handle difficult customers, how to stay calm under pressure, how to think on my feet. I had raised 3 children on my own after Robert died. I had balanced checkbooks, fixed leaky faucets, changed flat tires. I was not some helpless old lady who needed to be managed. I was Margaret Rose Thompson, and I had been underestimated my whole life. The next morning I made a decision. I got dressed in my best outfit, the blue dress Robert had bought me for our last anniversary. I brushed my hair, put on lipstick, and walked to the public library 6 blocks away. The librarian, a kind woman named Janet, recognized me from my weekly visits. "Mrs. Thompson, we haven't seen you in a while. How are you doing?" "I'm researching tenant rights," I said firmly. "And I need to use the computer." For the next 3 hours, I learned everything I could about housing laws in Texas. I discovered that even if someone lives in a garage, if they've been there for more than a certain number of days, they have rights. I learned about constructive eviction, about elder abuse, about documentation. I also learned about something called a 30-day notice. If someone wants you to leave their property, they have to give you written notice. 30 days. They can't just make your life miserable until you leave. But here's the thing they didn't know about me. I had been keeping a diary for 50 years. Every day I wrote down what happened, where I went, who I talked to, what I ate for dinner. It was a habit I'd started when Tommy was born, thinking someday I'd want to remember these moments. Those diary entries were about to become my evidence. I walked back to the house with purpose in my step. Sarah was in the kitchen, making lunch for her children. She looked up when I entered through the garage door. "Oh, Margaret. How was your walk?" "Educational," I said simply. That afternoon I called my old friend Betty from the diner. We had worked together for 20 years before she retired. "Betty," I said, "I need a favor. Can you pick me up tomorrow morning? I need to go to the courthouse." "Of course, honey. Is everything all right?" "It will be," I said. That night I didn't sleep in the garage. Instead, I sat at the small folding table they'd given me and wrote. I wrote down every conversation I'd overheard, every cold night, every time I'd been made to feel like a burden. I wrote about the lawyer they'd contacted, about their plan to make me leave voluntarily. I wrote about the woman who had raised their children when they were working late, who had cooked their meals when Sarah was too tired, who had cleaned their house without being asked. I wrote about the monthly Social Security checks I'd been contributing to their household expenses for the past 6 months. Most importantly, I wrote about the property. The house that Tommy and Sarah lived in. The one they were so worried about being crowded. I had helped them buy it. When they couldn't qualify for the mortgage on their own, I had co-signed. My name was on the deed. They had forgotten that detail. But I hadn't. The next morning, Betty picked me up in her old Buick. We drove to the courthouse in downtown Houston, where I filed a formal complaint. Not for a restraining order or a lawsuit. Something much simpler and more powerful. Filed an eviction notice. You see, as a co-owner of the property, I had the right to determine who lived there. And I had decided that people who would force an elderly woman to sleep in a garage were no longer welcome in my house. The clerk, a young man with kind eyes, looked at my paperwork carefully. Mrs. Thompson, are you sure about this? Evicting your own family. They're the ones who chose to make me family last, I said. They evicted me from my own home the day they put me in that garage. He stamped the papers. 30 days notice, as required by law. Betty drove me back to the house. I asked her to wait in the car. I had something to deliver. I walked through the garage, through the kitchen, and into the living room where Tommy and Sarah were watching their afternoon shows. I set the manila envelope on the coffee table, right next to Sarah's cup of tea. What's this? Tommy asked, looking confused. Your eviction notice, I said calmly. You have 30 days to find a new place to live. Sarah's face went white. You can't be serious. I'm very serious. I'm also the co-owner of this house, which you seem to have forgotten. Tommy opened the envelope with shaking hands. His face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, then something that might have been respect. Mom, you can't just. I can just, I interrupted. And I did. You see, while you were planning to make me so miserable that I'd leave voluntarily, I was learning about my rights. Sarah stood up, her voice getting higher. This is crazy. You're being dramatic. I'm being practical. You wanted me out of your house. Well, congratulations. Now you can be out of my house. But where will we go? Tommy asked. I looked at my son, this man I had raised, who had once brought me dandelions from the yard and called them the most beautiful flowers in the world. This man who had grown up to think his mother was disposable. I don't know, I said. But I imagine you'll figure it out. You're both very good at making arrangements. I turned to walk back to the garage, then stopped. Oh, and I'll be moving back into the master bedroom tomorrow. I think I've spent enough time sleeping on concrete. The next morning, I woke up in my own bed for the first time in a week. The sheets were clean, the mattress was soft, and sunlight streamed through the window I had picked out when Robert and I first bought this house 30 years ago. I could hear them in the kitchen, talking in hushed voices, making phone calls. Sarah's mother, Tommy's sister, anyone who might take them in for a month while they found a new place. I made my coffee and sat at the kitchen table, my kitchen table, and opened my diary to a fresh page. Today, I wrote, I remembered who I am. The thing about being underestimated your whole life is that people forget you've been watching. They forget you've been learning. They think because you're quiet, you're weak. They think because you're old, you're helpless. But I wasn't helpless. I was just being patient. Over the next few days, the house felt different. Tommy and Sarah moved around like strangers, whispering to each other, making plans. They were polite to me now, almost formal, as if they suddenly remembered I was a person with feelings and rights. Their children, my grandchildren, didn't understand what was happening. 8-year-old Lucy asked me, Grandma, why are Mommy and Daddy packing boxes? I knelt down to her level. Sometimes, sweetheart, people need to find their own special place to live. Your parents are going to find a wonderful new home just for your family. But what about you, Grandma? I smiled, the first real smile I'd felt in weeks. I'm going to stay right here where I belong. A week later, my old friend Janet from the library called. Margaret, I heard through the grapevine about what happened. Are you doing all right? I'm doing better than all right, I said. I'm doing perfectly. Good for you. You know, there's a position opening up here at the library. Part-time, just a few hours a week helping with the senior programs. Interested? Thought about it. Going back to work at 73. Why not? I had spent my whole life taking care of other people. Maybe it was time to take care of myself. I'd love to, I said. That same day I got another call. This one from my neighbor, Mrs. Chen. She was elderly, living alone, and had been struggling with her yard work. Margaret, I don't want to impose, but I heard you might be looking for something to do. I could use some help with my garden, and I'd be happy to pay. I'd be happy to help, I said. And you don't need to pay me. We neighbors should look out for each other. By the end of the second week, I had transformed from a burden into a resource. I was helping at the library, tending Mrs. Chen's garden, and volunteering at the community center. I was busy, useful, and most importantly, I was valued. Tommy and Sarah found an apartment across town. It was smaller than the house, more expensive, and they had to pay a security deposit they couldn't really afford. But they were together and they were on their own. On moving day, Tommy came to me with tears in his eyes. "Mom, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for what we did to you." I looked at this man who was my son, who had made a terrible mistake but was trying to make it right. "I forgive you, Tommy. But I don't forget. And I hope you've learned something from this." "I have," he said. "I've learned that you're a lot stronger than I gave you credit for." Sarah stood in the doorway, her arms full of boxes. She looked smaller somehow, less confident. "Margaret, I hope you know we never meant for things to go this far." "But they did go this far," I said simply. "You made choices, and choices have consequences. I hope your new home brings you happiness." She nodded, unable to meet my eyes. After they left, I walked through the house that was fully mine again. Felt bigger, brighter, more peaceful. I had reclaimed not just my space, but my dignity. That evening I called my sister Linda in California. We hadn't talked in months, but I needed to share my story with someone who would understand. "Margaret," she said, her voice bright with surprise. "How are you doing?" "I'm doing wonderfully," I said. "And I have a story to tell you." I told her everything. About the garage, about the cold nights, about the conversations I'd overheard. I told her about the research, the eviction notice, the moment I had taken back my power. Linda was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You know what, Margaret? I'm proud of you. You've always been the strong one in the family, but this is something else." "I just got tired of being invisible," I said. "Well, you're definitely not invisible anymore." She was right. Word had gotten around the neighborhood about what had happened. Not in a gossipy way, but in a respectful way. People nodded to me differently now. They saw me as someone who had stood up for herself, who had refused to be pushed around. A month later, I was working in Mrs. Chen's garden when a young woman approached me. She was probably in her 40s, with tired eyes and a worried expression. "Excuse me, are you Margaret Thompson?" "I am," I said, brushing dirt off my hands. "My name is Carol. I heard about what happened with your son and daughter-in-law. I was wondering, could I talk to you about something?" We sat on Mrs. Chen's porch, and Carol told me her story. Her elderly mother was living with her family, and her husband was becoming increasingly resentful. He was starting to make comments about other options, and not being able to do this forever. "I don't know what to do," Carol said. "I love my mother, but I'm starting to feel like I'm stuck in the middle." I listened to her story, and I heard echoes of my own experience. The subtle pressure, the gradual erosion of dignity, the way families can sometimes forget that elderly people are still people. "The first thing you need to know," I told her, "is that your mother deserves to be treated with respect no matter what. If your husband can't handle that, then you need to have a serious conversation with him." I gave her some practical advice about resources for elderly care, about having honest conversations with family members, about setting boundaries and expectations. "But most importantly," I said, "don't let anyone make your mother feel like she's a burden. She's not. She's a person who has lived a full life and deserves to be honored for that." Carol thanked me and left, but she wasn't the last person to seek me out. Over the next few months, I became something I had never expected to be. An advocate. Other elderly people in the neighborhood started coming to me with their problems. Adult children who were struggling with caregiving. Families who needed someone to help them navigate difficult conversations. I wasn't a trained counselor or social worker. I was just a woman who had been through something difficult and had found a way to stand up for herself. But apparently that was enough. I started a small support group that met at the community center every Tuesday evening. We called it Grey Power, and it was for people over 60 who wanted to maintain their independence and dignity. We talked about legal rights, about financial planning, about how to have difficult conversations with family members. We shared stories and offered support to each other. One evening, a woman named Dorothy shared her story. She was living with her daughter's family, and they had started treating her like a child. They monitored her phone calls, decided what she could and couldn't eat, and made her ask permission to leave the house. "I feel like I'm disappearing," she said, tears in her eyes. The group rallied around Dorothy. We helped her understand her rights, connected her with resources, and most importantly, we reminded her that she was still a capable, intelligent adult who deserved to make her own choices. Within a month, Dorothy had found a small apartment in a senior-friendly complex. She was happier than she had been in years. "You saved my life," she told me. "No," I said. "You saved your own life. I just reminded you that you could." My relationship with Tommy and Sarah slowly began to improve. They would visit occasionally, always polite, always respectful. The grandchildren came by more often, and I cherished those visits. Tommy never explicitly apologized for what had happened, but his actions spoke louder than words. He started calling me more often, asking how I was doing if I needed anything. He included me in family events and holidays. Sarah was more cautious, but she was trying. She would ask about my work at the library, about my garden, about my support group. She seemed genuinely interested in my life as an independent person, not just as a grandmother. One day Lucy asked me, "Grandma, are you happy living all by yourself?" I thought about it for a moment. "You know what, sweetheart? I'm very happy. I like having my own space, my own schedule, my own choices. But don't you get lonely?" "Sometimes," I said honestly. "But lonely is different from being alone. I have friends, I have work I enjoy, I have you and your brother to visit. I have a full life." And I did. My days were busy and purposeful. I worked at the library 3 mornings a week, helped with Mrs. Chen's garden, ran my support group, and volunteered at the community center. I had found a rhythm that worked for me. I also started writing. Not just in my diary, but real writing. I began documenting the stories of the people in my support group, with their permission. I wanted to create a record of how older adults could maintain their independence and dignity, even in difficult circumstances. The local newspaper heard about my group and asked to do a feature story. I was hesitant at first, but I realized that sharing our stories might help other people who were struggling with similar situations. The article was titled "Grey Power: How One Woman's Stand Against Family Abuse Sparked a Movement." It told my story, but it also highlighted the work our group was doing to help other elderly people. The response was overwhelming. I received letters from people all over Texas, sharing their own stories and asking for advice. Some were elderly people who felt invisible in their own families. Others were adult children who were struggling with caregiving and needed guidance. I realized that what had happened to me in that garage was not unique. It was part of a much larger problem. How society treats its elderly members, how families can sometimes forget that older adults are still full human beings with rights and dignity. I started writing a book. Not a memoir, but a practical guide for older adults who wanted to maintain their independence, and for families who wanted to provide support without taking away dignity. The book was called Still Here: A Guide to Aging with Dignity and Power. It covered everything from legal rights to financial planning to having difficult conversations with family members. I self-published it, not expecting much. But it struck a chord. Within 6 months, I had sold thousands of copies. I was invited to speak at senior centers, libraries, and community groups across the state. At one of these speaking events, a woman approached me afterward. She was probably in her 50s, with tears in her eyes. "My mother is living with us," she said. "And I'm ashamed to say that I've been treating her the way your son treated you. Your story made me realize what I was doing. The important thing," I told her, "is that you recognize it now. It's not too late to change." She nodded, wiping her eyes. "I'm going to go home and have a real conversation with my mother. About what she needs, what she wants, how we can make this work for everyone." That conversation, and dozens like it, reminded me why I was doing this work. It wasn't about revenge or proving a point. It was about helping people understand that aging doesn't mean losing your humanity. 2 years after the garage incident, I was invited to speak at a conference on elder care in Dallas. The audience was mostly social workers, nurses, and family counselors. I stood at the podium, looking out at hundreds of faces, and I felt that familiar surge of purpose. I want to tell you about a garage, I began. Not because it was the worst thing that ever happened to me, but because it was the moment I remembered who I was. I told my story simply, without drama or self-pity. I talked about the cold nights, the conversations I overheard, the moment I decided to fight back. The garage was just a symbol, I said. The real problem was that I had become invisible to my own family. They saw me as a burden, a problem to be solved, rather than a person to be honored. I talked about the importance of seeing elderly people as complete human beings, not just bodies to be cared for. I talked about the difference between helping someone and controlling them. When we strip away an older person's choices, their independence, their dignity, we're not helping them, I said. We're slowly erasing them. After the speech, a young social worker approached me. Mrs. Thompson, I work with families dealing with elder care issues. Would you be willing to consult on some cases? To help families understand the perspective of the elderly person. I agreed. Over the next year, I worked with dozens of families, helping them navigate the complex emotions and practical challenges of multi-generational living. In every case, the solution came down to the same basic principles: respect, communication, and remembering that older adults are still adults. 3 years after the garage, I was living a life I had never imagined. I was busier and more fulfilled than I had been in decades. I had found my voice, my purpose, my power. One morning I was working in my garden when Tommy pulled up in his car. He got out slowly, his face serious. "Mom, can we talk?" We sat on my porch, the same porch where I used to sit with Robert in the evenings, watching the sunset. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened," he said. "About the garage, about how we treated you. I want you to know that I'm ashamed of myself." I waited for him to continue. "I was so worried about my own problems, my own stress, that I forgot you were a person with feelings and needs. I treated you like you were just in the way." "Yes," I said simply. "You did. I know you've forgiven me," he said. "But I don't think I've forgiven myself. I keep thinking about you in that garage, cold and alone, while we were inside complaining about you." Tommy started crying then, something I hadn't seen him do since he was a child. "You were always there for me, Mom. When Dad died, when I was struggling in school, when I needed help with the down payment on the house. You never said no, you never made me feel like a burden." "That's what parents do," I said. "We take care of our children. But I didn't take care of you when you needed it. I failed you." I reached over and took his hand. "You made a mistake, Tommy. Big one. But you learned from it and you're trying to do better. That's what matters now." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the neighborhood wake up around us. "I'm proud of you, Mom," he said finally. "For standing up for yourself, for helping other people, for not letting what we did to you make you bitter." "I'm not bitter," I said. "I'm grateful. What happened to me led me to discover who I really am. I found my voice, my strength, my purpose. In a strange way, that garage was the beginning of the best chapter of my life." Tommy smiled through his tears. "Only you could find the positive in sleeping in a garage." "I didn't find the positive in sleeping in a garage," I corrected him. "I found the positive in refusing to accept that I deserved to sleep in a garage." A few months later, Tommy and Sarah bought a house with a mother-in-law suite. They asked if I wanted to move in with them. "Thank you," I said. "But no. I like my independence. I like my own space. I like being able to make my own choices." "We understand," Sarah said. "But the offer stands. Always." I appreciated that. It meant they had learned something from our experience. They had learned that taking care of someone doesn't mean taking away their autonomy. My support group continued to grow. We moved to a larger space at the community center, and I started training other older adults to become group leaders. The movement was spreading to other cities across Texas. I received a letter from a woman in Austin who had started her own Gray Power group after reading my book. She thanked me for showing her that it was possible to age with dignity and strength. You proved that we don't have to disappear just because we're getting older, she wrote. We can still be powerful, still be important, still be seen. That letter sits on my desk now, next to a photo of Robert and me on our wedding day. Two reminders of different kinds of love. Romantic love and the love that comes from helping others find their strength. I'm 76 now, and I'm still working, still advocating, still learning. I have a full life, rich with purpose and connection. I have friends, work I'm passionate about, and a family that has learned to respect me. But most importantly, I have myself. I know who I am, what I'm worth, and what I deserve. I know that I am not a burden, not a problem to be solved, not someone who should be grateful for scraps. I am Margaret Rose Thompson, and I am still here. That garage taught me something important. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you can become the catalyst for the best thing that happens to you. Not because suffering is good, but because surviving it can reveal strengths you didn't know you had. I think about all the women who have reached out to me over the years, sharing their stories of feeling invisible, unwanted, pushed aside. I think about the families who have learned to do better, to see their elderly members as full human beings deserving of respect and dignity. Change is possible, not just for individuals but for families, for communities, for society. It starts with one person refusing to accept that they deserve less than basic human dignity. It starts with someone saying, "Not me. Not today. Not anymore." For me, that moment came in a garage in Houston, Texas, on a cold July night when I decided I was worth more than concrete floors and thin blankets. When I decided I was worth fighting for. I hope that if you're listening to this story, and you recognize yourself in it, you'll remember that you're worth fighting for too. You're worth more than being pushed aside, being made to feel invisible, being treated like a burden. You have value. You have dignity. You have rights. And you have the power to stand up for yourself no matter how old you are, no matter how vulnerable you feel. The garage doesn't have to be the end of your story. It can be the beginning of a new chapter, one where you remember who you are and reclaim your place in the world. My name is Margaret Rose Thompson. I'm a mother, a grandmother, a former waitress, a current advocate, and a woman who refused to disappear. I'm still here. And if you're listening to this, you're still here too. That means we still have work to do. Stories to tell. People to help. Lives to change. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for believing that older adults deserve dignity and respect. Thank you for being part of the solution. And remember, you're never too old to stand up for yourself. You're never too old to demand better. You're never too old to change the world. Here at Granny's Voice, we believe in the power of our stories. We believe that every elderly person has wisdom to share, experiences that matter, and a voice that deserves to be heard. We're not just telling stories for entertainment. We're creating a movement, a community of people who refuse to let age make them invisible. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of your own, write it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to Granny's Voice.